In the ancient Near East, survival was tied entirely to the land and the patriarchal family. If famine hit or the male heads of a household died, the surviving family was cut off from their primary support. We see the stark physical reality of this environment in the stone architecture and harsh, dry terrain of Bethlehem. Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth return to this rigid social structure as widows. They own no working land and have no husbands or sons to advocate for them at the city gates. Furthermore, Ruth is a Moabite, a foreigner from a rival nation. They are completely outside the bounds of any traditional social safety net. Their only legal recourse was a system called gleaning. Ancient agricultural law required landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested and to intentionally ignore any grain that fell to the ground during the reaping process. The destitute were permitted to walk behind the paid workers and scavenge these leftovers. In practice, this meant spending 10 to 12 hours bent over under the Middle Eastern sun, digging through sharp barley stubble and dry soil to find enough dropped seeds to account for a single day's calories. For Ruth, the severe physical toll was compounded by physical danger. Working far behind the protective line of the main harvesters, she was an easy target for harassment or assault by the field hands. When Ruth tells Naomi she is going to glean, she is making a high-risk gamble. She is offering her own physical safety to secure a few handfuls of grain so her mother-in-law won't starve. The field Ruth happens to enter belongs to a man named Boaz. He is a prominent figure in Bethlehem, possessing significant wealth, massive tracts of land, and direct authority over dozens of workers. When Boaz arrives from the city, his first interaction with his crew reveals his character. He greets his reapers by blessing them in the name of the Lord, and they bless him in return. He operates his business with an active, visible respect for the laborers working his land. Boaz immediately notices the unfamiliar woman working in the margins of his property. He asks his foreman about her, and the foreman identifies her as the Moabite woman who recently arrived from Moab with Naomi. Rather than ignoring her or ordering her off his land, Boaz approaches Ruth directly. He instructs her to stay in his fields exclusively. He gives his young men strict orders not to touch her, and tells Ruth that whenever she is thirsty, she can drink from the private water vessels his workers have drawn. In a society where foreigners and widows are easily exploited, Boaz uses his immense authority to turn a high-risk agricultural worksite into a protected sanctuary for the most vulnerable person in Bethlehem. A moment of wonder. Ruth falls to her face, bowing to the dirt. She asks Boaz directly why she, a complete stranger and an outsider, is receiving this specific grace. Boaz explains his motivation. He has heard the full report of how she left her homeland, her parents, and her gods to care for her widowed mother-in-law. He recognizes her profound loyalty and repays it with his own provision. When mealtime arrives, Boaz invites Ruth to sit beside the paid reapers. He personally passes her roasted grain, allowing her to eat until she is completely full, and she even leaves with extra food. A wealthy landowner invites a destitute scavenger to sit in the shade and eat at his own table. This chart illustrates the stark difference between standard gleaning and what Boaz does next. When Ruth gets up to return to work, Boaz pulls his men aside with a secret instruction. He orders them to pull out entire handfuls of grain from the bundles, handfuls of purpose, and drop them deliberately in her path. By leaving the grain for Ruth to gather herself, Boaz guarantees a massive yield while preserving the dignity of her own labor. Boaz has moved far past the legal minimums of agricultural charity. He engineers a hidden system of provision that completely bypasses the brutal mechanics of scarcity. Evening falls, and Ruth beats out the barley she has gathered before carrying it back into the city to show Naomi. This visual scale compares a typical gleaner's daily yield to what Ruth actually brought home. She produces an entire ephah of barley, roughly 30 to 50 pounds of grain, along with the leftover roasted food from Boaz's table. Naomi sees the sheer volume of the grain and immediately understands this is not the result of a lucky day of scavenging. She asks who took notice of Ruth, recognizing that someone has deliberately intervened to keep them alive. When Ruth names Boaz, Naomi reveals a crucial piece of ancient Israelite law. Boaz is a kinsman-redeemer, a specific legal designation for a close relative who has the right to buy back lost family land, pay off debts, and rescue a destitute family line from total ruin. Boaz holds the legal authority to restore their family's place in society. His radical provision in the field signals to Naomi that this encounter is the first step toward permanent restoration. Profound providence invites the outcast to the table, provides handfuls of purpose, and permanently rewrites the future.